In the heart of Persepolis, where the marble still breathed incense and the air was heavy with the perfume of the gods, there existed a place that did not appear on any map of the empire, the imperial harem. A city within a city, a labyrinth of silent corridors where sighs were older than prayers. Whoever entered there did not return, and the walls, as high as their owner's ambition, hid more than just bodies. They hid the history that time tried to erase. One autumn night, as the desert cooled beneath the moon, a young girl of barely 15 was prepared for what the servants called the supreme honor. Her skin trembled, not out of fear of death, for in Persia, one learned to fear it from childhood, but because she understood the weight of a destiny sealed by the most powerful man in the world. They say the body never lies, and that girl's body told a truth the scribes never dared to record. Her eyes looked like those of an old woman, her back curved under an invisible weight. Her lips had forgotten how to pronounce her own name. She was not a princess awaiting her glory. She was a victim of a system that had turned power into a religion, silence into a form of worship. In the temples of Zoroastrianism, divine light was spoken of as a symbol of good, but in that palace, light was a punishment. It illuminated too much. Every oil lamp burned like an uncomfortable witness, unable to look away. And to understand why that king, who believed himself to be the manifestation of the god Ahura Mazda, ended up locked in his own golden hell, one must go back long before that night, to the moment when the greatness of the Persian Empire reached its highest point and began to rot from the inside. Xerxes was born in the year 519 BC into a world that revered him even before he took his first breath. Son of Darius the Firm and Atossa, grandson of the mythical Cyrus the Great, he was raised to believe that his word was the law of the heavens. From childhood, he was told that the universe bowed before him, that men were tools of his will. He was not taught philosophy, but the theology of domination. The priest told him that his body was a temple, that his desire was sacred, that he could decide the fate of others without guilt because everything that emanated from him was, by definition, divine. At 5 years old, he already knew how to command and punish. At 10, he knew that no one could look him directly in the eyes without permission. At 20, when he inherited the throne after his father's death, he could no longer distinguish between obedience and love. But behind the magnificence of the throne, something was slowly germinating. The young king's mother, Atossa, had taught him the art of distrust. She whispered to him that brothers could become enemies, that sons could be traitors, that a wife could hide poison behind a kiss. She repeated to him, like a venomous prayer, a king must possess everything he loves, or he will lose it. That phrase, which was born as a warning, became Xerxes' intimate creed. From then on, the idea of possessing became synonymous with existing for him. An empire, a city, a person, everything was property. Everything was an extension of his power. And power, when it finds no limits, begins to devour itself. Outside, the world called him the King of Kings. Inside, he was just a man who was beginning to confuse the echo of his own voice with the voice of the gods. The marble reflected his image, but it no longer reflected humanity. And as the sun set behind the walls of Persepolis, the gates of the empire slowly closed upon his destiny. To understand the tyrant, one must look at the child. In Xerxes' education, the concept of fragility did not exist. At the Royal Academy of Susa, where gold shone as brightly as ambition, Zoroastrian priests molded the heirs to the throne as if they were divine sculptures. They taught them that the monarch's will was a reflection of the light of Ahura Mazda, the god of order and purity. But beneath that resplendent doctrine hid a dark idea. If the king was the incarnation of divinity, then no act of his could be considered unjust. Thus Xerxes grew up, believing that the entire world existed to confirm his greatness. While other children learned the art of reading or music, he learned the art of being feared. By his adolescence, he already understood that respect was built with fear and that loyalty was more enduring when born of terror. That was his first lesson in governance. His father, Darius the Firm, had conquered immense territories from the Indus to Egypt. The borders of the empire stretched beyond the horizon. But with each victory, the weight of power grew, and the young prince breathed that dense air of greatness, like someone unknowingly inhaling poison. Every paternal triumph was an expectation placed upon his shoulders. He had to surpass him, he had to be more feared, more glorious, more eternal. His mother, Atassa, watched him in silence. She was a woman born among myths, daughter of the empire's founder, accustomed to fear being just another language. In the palace corridors, Atassa repeated stories of family betrayals, brothers slitting each other's throats for the crown, wives poisoning their husbands, sons conspiring against their fathers. Those stories were not tales, they were warnings. And Xerxes, who listened to them with the eyes of a child and the mind of an heir, began to understand love as a form of absolute possession. A king must possess everything he loves, or he will lose it. That phrase resonated in his mind like a sacred mantra. From then on, his worldview became distorted. To love was to dominate. To govern was to consume. When Darius died, Xerxes was 20 years old and was no longer a prince. He was an incarnate idea of power. At his father's funeral, the Persian nobles prostrated themselves before him, touching the ground with their foreheads. Xerxes did not see men. He saw shadows that existed to uphold his figure. He was crowned king of kings, but inside him, something broke. The boundary between the divine and the human disappeared. During the early years of his reign, the young emperor ruled with discipline. He crushed rebellions in Babylon and Egypt with military precision, as if order were his religion. But the blood of the conqueror was not enough. His mother's echo remained within him, reminding him that power had to expand or it would die. And then came Greece, small, undisciplined, rebellious, a blemish on the map of his perfection. For Xerxes, conquering it was not a military necessity, but a spiritual one. If he defeated the Greeks, the gods themselves would confirm his divinity. Thus began his true metamorphosis, that of the king who wanted to become a myth. Under his command, bridges were built over the Hellespont. Impossible armies were gathered. Camps were spread out where the tents blended with the horizon. Herodotus would later say that he crossed the strait with more than 1,000,000 men, an impossible figure, but not for the ego of one who believed himself eternal. The day a storm destroyed his bridges, Xerxes ordered the sea to be whipped. No one dared to laugh. The court celebrated it as a symbol of divine authority, but in reality, it was the first symptom of a disease that history would take centuries to diagnose: the madness of absolute power. When the waves strike a man and he decides to punish them, he is no longer ruling an empire. He is fighting against reality, and that battle inevitably would destroy him from within. For years, Xerxes believed that greatness was a hereditary right. His army, the most powerful on earth, marched beneath golden banners and drums that made the mountains tremble. The campaign against Greece was meant to be his divine consecration, the moment he would prove to the world that his will knew no borders. However, the gods, who usually speak in the language of silence, had other plans. When his troops crossed the Hellespont on pontoon bridges, Xerxes did not see wood or ropes. He saw an extension of his own body. Every step of his soldiers was a beat of his imperial heart. He believed that by advancing toward the west, he was advancing toward eternity. And for a time it seemed so. Cities fell, walls surrendered, foreign tongues pronounced his name with fear. But fear does not build loyalty. It only obeys until it finds a reason to rebel. In the summer of 480 BC, Xerxes reached the shores of Greece. From his portable throne, he looked out at the sea and smiled. That horizon would be his. He ordered the construction of altars and sacrifices to honor Ahura Mazda, convinced that the winds would obey him. But the winds have memory, and they remember men who believe themselves to be gods. A storm, unpredictable and fierce, destroyed part of his fleet. Xerxes, unable to accept defeat, ordered the sea to be lashed with leather whips. The gesture that was meant to reaffirm his power became a symbol of his disconnection from reality. The subsequent battles would be his downfall. At Salamis, the Greeks, much weaker in numbers, destroyed his armada. At Plataea, his army was humiliated. For the first time in his life, the King of Kings knew the word failure, not from the mouths of his enemies, but in the empty stares of his own generals. No one dared to utter it, but he felt it, like a crack in the marble of his throne. Defeat for a common man is a stumble. For a self-proclaimed god, it is heresy. Xerxes returned to Persepolis not only vanquished, but broken. The return journey was a silent procession. The drums fell silent. The banners withered beneath the sun. It was no longer an empire marching, but the shadow of one. Along the way, the emperor began to look with resentment upon the things he once found beautiful: the temples, the songs, the advice of his wise men. The voice of his mother, dead for years, resonated once again. A king must possess everything he loves. But how does one possess an empire that is crumbling? How does one dominate a world that no longer fears? Xerxes' answer was devastating. If he could not control the borders of his kingdom, he would control the borders of his immediate surroundings. And if the external universe reminded him of his fragility, he would create an internal universe where nothing could challenge him. That universe would be the imperial harem. The man who had wanted to rule seas, peoples, and gods began to rule the breathing of those who could not look him in the eye. He transformed love into duty, obedience into ritual, flesh into a symbol of his lost authority. The eunuchs recorded schedules, the architects raised walls, the priests wrote hymns justifying his divine right to possess everything. Thus, military defeat became a spiritual victory, a poisoned victory. Xerxes had discovered a new form of conquest, no longer of lands but of wills. The same impulse that drove him to cross the sea now pushed him to cross the limits of morality and the soul. The outside world might mock his fall, but inside the palace, no one laughed. Only the rhythmic sound of his footsteps could be heard at nightfall, pacing corridors where gold shone as brightly as fear. That was Xerxes' second transformation, from invincible emperor to prisoner of his own greatness. When Xerxes returned to Persepolis for good, the air in the palace was no longer the same. The marble that once reflected feasts and banquets became a mute mirror of his isolation. Foreign ambassadors were no longer received. Public audiences were replaced by enigmatic decrees that no one understood. The king who once spoke to the world began to speak only to himself. The splendor of the empire remained intact in appearance, but the heart that sustained it was slowly rotting. The architects who previously designed temples and gardens now built walls within walls. Thus was born the new imperial harem, a fortress within a fortress, guarded by eunuchs, where power was transformed into a secret right. The place was conceived as a sanctuary, but it ended up being a golden prison where obedience was the only way to survive. Chroniclers would later speak of its dimensions: walls 15 meters high, bronze doors, corridors perfumed with Arabian incense. No one who entered there ever came out. The luxury was so excessive that it bordered on madness: gold-plated mosaics, silver fountains, tapestries brought from Egypt, all to disguise an emptiness that not even wealth could fill. Xerxes began to visit the harem every night, like someone descending into a dark temple. What was once a dynastic custom became an obsession. His entourage tried to justify it with noble words. The King of Kings seeks cosmic harmony, but the servant's eyes said otherwise. He was looking for something he had lost in Greece, the feeling of being invincible. In that search, the emperor confused faith with control, devotion with possession. Zoroastrianism, the religion that had taught the eternal struggle between light and darkness, became distorted on his lips. He no longer spoke of spiritual purity, but of purity of lineage. He believed that his blood was a reflection of divinity, and that to touch it was to touch the order of the universe. And so the palace began to organize itself according to his new logic. Women classified by age, beauty, origin, schedules regulated by water clocks, silences imposed like prayers. Mothers were separated from their daughters, maidens instructed in rituals they themselves did not understand. Everything was done in the name of imperial order, everything under the mask of the sacred. The eunuchs of the harem became the new priests of fear. They managed the records, controlled movements, decided who could be seen and who had to disappear. No one questioned anything. In Persepolis, obedience was the most valuable currency, and silence the highest form of faith. Outside the walls, the people still adored him. The temples proclaimed his name in hymns, the nobles repeated his title, Shahanshah, King of Kings. But inside the palace, Xerxes had ceased to be a man. He was a shadow wrapped in gold, a god tired of being worshipped, who only found solace in absolute control. Time began to blur inside the harem. The seasons changed, but the lights, the voices, the rites remained identical. In that closed universe, clocks did not mark hours but wills. Maidens grew up without knowing if it was day or night, learning that obedience was a way of breathing. On his solitary throne, Xerxes contemplated the horizon through a barred window. He did not see the desert or the stars. He saw the distorted reflection of himself. Perhaps he sensed that the external empire was crumbling, but he no longer cared. He had created an internal kingdom where every silence was a victory and every fearful glance, proof that he was still a god. Thus began the true twilight of his reign, not with swords or battles, but with the constant murmur of fear, a murmur that, with the passage of time, would become the only hymn of his empire. In the heart of the palace, the order was perfect, almost mathematical. Everything was recorded, from the fragrances used in the harem baths to the exact number of steps separating one chamber from another. The administration of desire had become a science. The guards dressed in white linen noted names, ages, dates, and hierarchies. What was once an imperial court transformed into a machinery of obedience, a religion without a soul. The Zoroastrian priests who previously preached the purity of fire now justified the impurity of power. They said that Xerxes was the light of Ahura Mazda made flesh, and that contradicting his will was an act of blasphemy. Thus, theology became an alibi. The temple and the throne were no longer distinguishable. Both demanded submission. The empire's elite participated in this perverse game of silence. Every noble, every advisor, every court physician knew what was happening within the golden walls of the harem. No one spoke, not out of loyalty, but out of fear. Silence was more profitable than the truth. Whoever stayed silent received gold, lands, titles. Whoever asked questions simply ceased to exist. The physicians, men educated in the science of life, became accomplices to spiritual death. They prepared tonics, herbs, and ointments intended to maintain the appearance of normality. They concealed fatigue, pain, and diseases of the soul. The health of the empire was a carefully designed illusion, as brilliant as the palace mosaics. But the most tragic complicity was that of the women themselves. Some, out of fear, learned to obey. Others, out of desperation, collaborated in the rituals to protect their daughters. In the harem, surviving meant participating. Maternal instinct transformed into a defense mechanism. Teaching the young girls to submit was the only way to keep them alive. Thus was born a generation of shadows who never knew childhood. Girls who learned to walk in silence, to not look directly into anyone's eyes, to accept their destiny without understanding it. They did not know they were prisoners because they had never known freedom. And in that imposed oblivion, the power of the King of Kings became absolute. Artabanus, captain of the guard, observed everything from a distance. He was a disciplined soldier, a man who had served with honor in the wars against Greece. But the Xerxes he knew no longer existed. In his place remained a crowned ghost, obsessed with the idea of controlling every last breath of his empire. Artabanus began to notice what the others pretended not to see. Power had become a disease. At night, when silence fell over Persepolis, the palace corridors breathed an unreal calm. The servants walked without making a sound. The musicians played melodies so soft they seemed like prayers. No one dared to break the stillness, because every sound could be heard by invisible ears. The surveillance was constant, but not physical. It was spiritual, psychological. Xerxes did not need spies. He had achieved something much more effective: fear as a political instrument. His authority did not depend on force, but on the feeling that he was everywhere, in every lit lamp, in every shadow of the corridor, in every whispered prayer. And yet, the more control he gained, the more the essential things escaped him: love, loyalty, inner peace. He had everything, but he felt nothing. His soul had become an exact replica of his empire, enormous, brilliant, and empty. That was how the perfect machinery of silence worked, a gearwork of faith, fear, and convenience, where no one was innocent and everyone, in some way, was a prisoner. Because in the heart of every tyranny, there is always a chorus of voices that prefer to remain silent. And that chorus, more than swords, is what keeps the monster alive. Over the years, the harem transformed into an invisible city. Its inhabitants had no names, only numbers. Girls were born, grew up, and grew old within the same marble walls, never knowing what existed beyond them. Days blurred into nights. Time was a straight line leading to oblivion. No one spoke of hope, because hope was considered a form of rebellion. The women who had become mothers slowly lost their sense of self. Some began to forget their own faces. Mirrors, by order of the emperor, were removed from the rooms. Reflection, Xerxes used to say, belongs only to the gods. In reality, he feared that the gazes of those women would reflect back the image of his own corruption. In that place, sanity was a fleeting privilege. Laughter turned into tears and tears into a silence that hurt more than any wound. From a young age, girls learned that obedience was a way of breathing. Their bodies moved with ritual precision, as if their souls had been replaced by habit. When one cried, the others embraced her without words, knowing that comfort could be dangerous. Mothers were powerless witnesses to a cycle that repeated generation after generation. Some tried to resist, refusing the rituals or hiding their daughters. But the palace walls did not tolerate defiance. No one disappeared with a noise. They simply vanished from the records. Disappearance became a language of power, silent, methodical, irreversible. The scribes, tasked with documenting every aspect of the empire, omitted names and dates when it came to the harem. Official history preferred triumphs, military victories, and offerings to the gods. No one wrote about the women behind the walls, because to write about them was to acknowledge they existed, and what is not named in the eyes of power cannot hurt. Artabanus, the captain of the guard, began to feel the weight of those absences. Every night he heard a murmur that did not come from the wind, but from the sealed rooms. It was a faint sound, like that of smothered prayers. The soldiers called it the sigh of the marble. He knew what it meant. The soul of the empire was sick. Meanwhile, Xerxes sank deeper and deeper into his delirium. He no longer sought pleasure or companionship. He sought the sensation of dominance. At banquets, he would often talk to himself, convinced that the gods were listening. The priests called him the chosen one. But his eyes no longer shone with the light of faith, but with the shadow of paranoia. He saw treason in every glance, heresy in every doubt. The palace became a collective prison. It wasn't just the women who were captives, so were the servants, the soldiers, the ministers. Everyone was afraid to speak. Everyone pretended not to see. In the gardens, flowers grew without fragrance. In the temples, the sacred fire burned weaker. It was as if the sky itself refused to witness that spectacle of obedience. Outside the palace, the people began to murmur. Legends spoke of a king who had lost his mind, of a court living in darkness. But in an empire where fear was worth more than truth, rumors were stifled before they were born. The cities continued to pay tribute, the temples continued to pray, and the name of Xerxes continued to be spoken with respect, though with less and less faith. Sometimes at night, the emperor would stand before the window of his chamber, watching the stars. He liked to think they were his daughters, obedient lights that would never abandon him. Perhaps he sensed deep down that he no longer ruled an empire, but a mausoleum inhabited by the ghosts of fear. And in that absolute silence, where not even prayers could break the stillness, the true curse of the King of Kings was born, to be worshipped by those who hated him, feared by those who loved him, and forgotten by the history he himself wrote with his own hands. The winter of 466 BC arrived with a strange cold over Persepolis. The flames of the sacred fire burned with a timidity that unsettled even the priests. The air smelled of incense and distrust. No one said it out loud, but everyone knew the empire was slowly dying, and its disease had only one name: Xerxes. Artabanus, the captain of the guard, had stopped sleeping. In his dreams, he saw the eyes of the missing young women. He heard the echo of laughter that no longer existed. He had served the emperor since his youth, had seen his glory in the days of war and his downfall in the days of fear. Now his loyalty had turned into guilt. "I have protected the monster from whom I swore to defend the world," he later wrote in his testimony. For months, Artabanus secretly gathered men who thought like him: nobles, soldiers, scribes, even priests tired of upholding the lie. They did not do it for justice, but for survival. They feared the king's madness would drag them all down. The plan was simple: end the reign of terror without destroying the facade of imperial order. The empire needed a silent sacrifice, not a revolution. As the plot advanced, the king's behavior became even more erratic. He spoke to shadows, demanded offerings to the fire, and surrounded himself only with eunuchs and maidens. He saw conspiracies in the folds of the curtains, heard voices calling to him from the hallways. His paranoia was so great that he began changing the guards every night, convinced that everyone was plotting his downfall. The decisive night was August 4th, 465. The air was still, too still. According to chroniclers, the king had ordered a spiritual retreat inside the harem, a ceremony only he understood. The hallways were cleared, the lamps lit. No one was to interrupt his sacred meditation. It was the opportunity the conspirators had been waiting for. Artabanus and his men entered through the service tunnels connecting the kitchens to the harem chambers. They walked barefoot, in silence, carrying small bronze daggers in the weight of an empire on their backs. Every step was a betrayal, but also a liberation. When they reached the king's chamber, the air was thick, as if time had stopped. There was no music, no voices, only the crackling of the lamps. And there, amidst the golden glow, they saw the King of Kings. He was no longer the living God the priest proclaimed. He was an old man, swollen from excesses, his eyes lost between madness and fear. Artabanus watched him for an eternal moment. He did not see his sovereign, but the creature that had devoured the soul of his nation. He approached without saying a word. The sound that broke the silence was not a scream, but a sigh. With a swift motion, the king fell. Official history would say he died in meditation, blessed by the gods. No one would speak of the trembling of Artabanus's hands, nor of the subsequent silence, heavier than death itself. The emperor's body was moved to his official chamber and carefully placed, surrounded by perfumes and flowers. The report that went out at dawn was brief and solemn. The beloved of Ahura Mazda has ascended to the light. The people wept, the priests prayed, and the empire breathed a sigh of relief. But the silence did not end with his death. Artabanus, watching the dawn over the walls of Persepolis, understood that horror does not disappear when its creator dies. It transforms, it is inherited, it adapts. The throne, though empty, remained the same altar. That night, for the first time in years, the wind blew freely over the palace terraces. But even the wind seemed to carry a lament, that of the voices that were never heard. The following dawn was strange. Persepolis awoke to the sound of trumpets, but without joy. Messengers ran through the stone avenues, solemnly proclaiming the news: the King of Kings has ascended to the realm of light. No one dared to ask how it had happened. In an empire educated in fear, truth was a dangerous currency. Artaxerxes the Mnemosyne, son of Xerxes, was crowned that same week. He was young, prudent, and silent. Everything his father was no longer. In his first decree, he ordered the imperial harem to be sealed forever, declaring he did so out of respect for his father's memory. But everyone in the court understood the real reason. Inside rested the darkest secrets of the dynasty. Over 3 days, the eunuchs and concubines were discreetly relocated to other palaces. Some were given to temples as priestesses of purity. Others were hastily married off to minor nobles to erase their origins. The youngest disappeared without a record. No one spoke their names. No one would ever write them down. Artaxerxes knew that silence was stronger than the sword. His reign began on a foundation of carefully planned oblivion. He ordered documents destroyed, diaries burned, and his father's personal archives closed. In official chronicles, Xerxes was portrayed as an honorable monarch, a devout ruler who died in peace. History once again became power's favorite weapon. The few remaining witnesses were eliminated with bureaucratic precision. The court physicians were retired due to advanced age. The priests who had served in the palace were transferred to distant regions. The eunuchs, guardians of the secrets, were executed one by one, accused of imaginary crimes. Mithridates, the last of them, left a written confession before he died. In it, he recounted what he had seen, what he had kept quiet about, and what history would refuse to believe for centuries. His manuscript would disappear into the sands of time until being rediscovered many centuries later. Meanwhile, Persepolis tried to reinvent itself. Artisans cleaned the palace walls, erased inscriptions, restored mosaics, and replaced symbols. The marble shone once more, but the shine was artificial, like makeup over a wound. The people were summoned to grand public ceremonies where the new king spoke of spiritual rebirth, of the purity of the dynasty, of the continuity of the divine light. It was a rehearsed speech for an audience tired of fearing. At night, old soldiers told stories in hushed voices. They spoke of screams that could still be heard from the closed tunnels, of lamps that lit themselves, of shadows walking through the abandoned corridors. Mothers forbade their children from going near the walls of the sealed harem. They called it the House of Silence. No one dared to break the spell of oblivion. Over the years, the figure of Xerxes was tamed by historians. The Greeks described him as a megalomaniac defeated at Salamis, the Persians as a minor link between Darius and Artaxerxes. Neither mentioned the human cost of his reign. The victims were erased not by violence, but by indifference. Power had learned an essential lesson. It is not necessary to destroy the truth. It is enough to bury it under layers of glory and myth. Outside, the empire continued to expand and contract, like an animal breathing slowly before it dies. But beneath the palace flagstones, the foundations held another story, one that could not be written with ink, only with memory. And so, silence, that word Xerxes revered more than any god, became the most enduring legacy of his reign. Because there are forms of power that do not end with death. They propagate like an echo, invisible, infinite. And while the scribes continued tracing the names of kings and battles, the voices of those nameless girls slipped like a whisper through the cracks in the marble. Centuries passed, and the name of Xerxes became a chapter in history books, a shadow on the marbles of Persepolis. The ruins, consumed by the wind, were visited by travelers seeking the remains of a glorious empire. No one imagined that beneath their feet slept the secrets the scribes had kept quiet. In 1931, a group of French archaeologists began an excavation at the ancient palace. For weeks, they removed layers of dust, sand, and time, until beneath the foundations of the harem, they found a sealed chamber. There was no gold or jewelry, only bones. The remains of women and girls, many of them showing signs of prolonged confinement. The official chronicles, which for 2 millennia had praised the protector of the weak, collapsed all at once. The discovery not only revealed a forgotten crime, it revealed the price of silence. Every bone fragment was a word that history had not dared to pronounce. Every palace wall became a mute witness to a power that had confused divinity with impunity. The archaeologists also found a small bronze chest. Inside were fragments of an Aramaic text signed with a name, Mithridates, guardian of the imperial harem. In it, he recounted his repentance and warned, "Power that does not fear the gods fears the mirror of its actions." That testimony forever changed the view of the Persian Empire. Modern historians no longer see Xerxes merely as the monarch defeated by the Greeks, but as the symbol of a disease that has accompanied power since the dawn of civilizations. The conviction that the divine justifies the inhuman. To walk through the ruins of Persepolis today is to walk between two worlds. In the sunlight, the carved reliefs show scenes of glory, soldiers, tributes, processions. But at dusk, when the wind blows from the desert, another kind of music seems to be heard, a faint, almost human murmur. Some say it is the echo of the wind, others that it is the voices of those who were never heard. And perhaps that is what history teaches us, that empires do not fall solely due to military defeats, but under the weight of their own shadows. When power fails to recognize the face of the other, it begins to dig its own grave. Xerxes' arrogance did not die with him. It lives on every time someone confuses obedience with faith, authority with truth. The ruins of Persepolis still stand, majestic, almost intact. But if one looks closely, the cracks can be seen, and in every crack a warning. The stones, though they may seem mute, remember. Because the true legacy of tyrants is not the conquest they achieve, but the lives they destroy. And those lives, no matter how much the centuries try to bury them, always find a way to speak again. Perhaps not with a voice, but with silence. A silence that pierces through time and that today still forces us to look inward. If this story moved you, share it. not out of morbid curiosity or for punishment, but for justice. Because as long as we remember the anonymous victims of power, their echo will remain alive, defying oblivion. Because to forget is to repeat, and history, when silenced, always ends up screaming.